Let's look at this idea of absolute versus relative referencing in a little bit more detail. I created a new table here on a separate sheet within my document. You can spend a little bit of time trying to recreate this, but before you do that, just follow along with what I'm doing so you can see what's happening when you're trying to use absolute versus relative referencing for specific rows and columns of your spreadsheet. After I do this, you might pause it and try and recreate everything that I have here. So what I want is I want to calculate the current for the 467.9 ohm resistor when it's 5 volts, 6 volts, 9 volts, and 12 volts. Then I want to also calculate the current for the 468.2 ohm resistor when it's 5 volts, 6 volts, 9 volts, 12 volts. So what's happening is I want this column to always be calculating using the 5 volts, but I want it to change relative to the resistance value. And I want this row to always be calculating the current relative to the 467.9 ohm resistor, but changing the voltage values. So somehow I need to work with locking in those rows and columns the appropriate way in order for it to keep the number that I absolutely want. Let's say, for instance, if I just put in the B3 value here. Now notice it's 467.9. That's exactly what we wanted. If I move this along relative to the path, it's still looking like 467.9, but if I click on it, notice it's referencing C3, this is referencing D3, this one is referencing E3. So that kind of fooled me into thinking it was always doing that, but it was actually moving relative to each term. Now if I drug it down here, it did not keep it the same as 467.9 because it moved downward relative to the cell that I had the formula in. Same thing if I were to put in C2, it gives me a 5. If I drag it down, it's always going to look like 5. But if I click on it, notice it's referencing C4. It's referencing the cell that's above it. But if I took that formula of equal to C2 and I drug it horizontally, it's going to update accordingly because it's moving relative to that cell. So what we want to do in order to calculate current is we want to say equals C2 divided by V3, and that gives me my current for that 467.9 ohm resistor when the voltage is 5 volts. Now if I take this and I drag it horizontally, I have new values, but I'm recognizing that I don't think that these are correct because I'm not going to have a current of 561.48 or 478.64. So if I click in, I can notice that it did move my voltage value, which is what I wanted it to do. I wanted it to move the voltage value, but it also moved my resistance value horizontally with the formula as it moved horizontally. So instead of still referencing 467.9, I'm now referencing C3, which is my current value that I calculated. Same thing here. If I click on E3, I see that my E2 is being referenced, which is the voltage that I want, but my D3 is now being referenced, which is the value that should be the calculation for the current when voltage is 6 volts. So something's not right here. One thing that worked correctly was the voltage values. The voltage values updated properly. Now if I want to always have 467.9 here, I can potentially lock in the row and the column, and that'll keep it to always be 467.9. So let's move the formula horizontally and see if it correctly calculates the values. So now I'm referencing D2, which is my 6 volt power supply, and it's referencing B3, which is my resistance. So that's correct. Same thing here, it's referencing E2, which is my 9 volt power supply, and it's always referencing my 467.9 resistance. So I know that it's calculating it correctly. Let's take that formula and let's drag it down one row. I immediately see that this is an issue. So this is not the right values for current. If I click in my cell to see what it's actually calculating, I see that it's doing C3, which is not my voltage value. That's a current value that I calculated, and it's dividing it by that 467.9. I didn't want 467.9, I wanted 468.2. So for some reason it's locking in that 467.9 and it's not changing it relative to the cell that I'm moving in. So for this resistance value, I want the columns to move relative to the cell. I just want the row to stay the same within the individual rows. So maybe there's something I can do here. So So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to see if I can change it to where it keeps these values for my calculation for current for 467.9, but I don't have it locked in just that one cell. So I can use it in different parts of my calculations. So I'm looking at this right here. I want it to always be B. I always want the column to be B. So maybe I'll leave the $ for B, but I don't want it to always be B3. I want it to be 3, B4, B5, B6, B7. So if I don't lock in that row, maybe I'll be able to keep that 467.9 when I'm calculating for the voltage 5, 6, 9, and 12, but not for when I'm calculating it for 468.2. But it will move to 468.2 when I need the current for the 5, 6, 9, 12 voltage. Let's see if this leaves these values here for the calculation of current. And it does. So if I click in, notice how I have just the $1 before the B, and it says 467.9, and it's using the right voltage value. Let's try this now. Drag it down. Still not right. Now it's referencing the correct resistance. The cell for voltage moved down relative to the formula as I moved it down one. So somehow now we want to lock in this row here, row 2. We always want it to be referencing row 2, but not necessarily just the 5 volts or just the 6 volts or just the 9 volts. We want it to be relative in the different columns to the voltage value that it's referencing. So we want it to stay the same row. So maybe we'll lock in with a $ for the row, and then notice for our resistance values we lock in the column with a $. I can drag this formula, see if it keeps it correct. It does. It didn't change those values. If I click in, I see that my row is locked in for the voltage, my column is locked in for the resistance, and now if I take it and drag it down, hopefully it updates the values correctly. So if I click in and check the formula, I'm doing 6 divided by 468.2. I'm doing 9 divided by 468.2. I'm doing 12 divided by 468.2. So now I can take this formula and just drag it right down, and I know that I'm doing my calculations appropriately. I can click in and just double check. 6 divided by 473.4, 9 divided by 472.2. So the thing that I want you to notice here, and I'm going to rewrite this formula in one cell and just show you can just put it in one cell, is that I can lock in my row and my column accordingly. So I know that I want to do C2 divided by B3, but I want to lock in my row 2 that's associated with my voltages C, D, E, and F. So I'm going to lock in row 2, and I'm going to divide it by my resistance, where I'm going to lock in my column, because I always want it to be along B, but I'm going to let the rows change relative to the cell that the formula is written in. When I hit enter, I can drag it vertically, and I can drag it horizontally, and it'll automatically populate my cells. So what I wanted you to gather from this information is that you don't have to lock in the row and the column. Sometimes you might just need the row locked in, and sometimes you might just need the column locked in. If you're just referencing one number like we have here, this 5, you can lock in both the row and the column, and it will do the formula appropriately. But always take a second to check and make sure your numbers are calculated the way that you intend them to be calculated. Click into the cell and check what it's calculating.